It was one of those biting March evening and 9 dead husbands were just coincidence. But the 10th? That's murder. Welcome to Warm Leaves. I am your host, Raven. Tell me where you're listening from. Your voices keep these mysteries alive. Let's uncover her truth. It was in St. Mary Mead when news like the east wind traveled quicker than one might think. The church bells had barely finished their somber toll when word began to circulate. Geraldine Whitcomb, lately married, yet again, had lost her 10th husband. Lost, in this case, meant he had been discovered dead in his study, the door bolted from the inside, a look of quiet surprise still fixed upon his face. Miss Marple heard it, naturally. Not from idle gossip, but from Mrs. Price Ridley, who had taken it upon herself to march down to the high street and declare in the greengrocer's that the matter was very shocking, though not entirely unexpected, considering her history. Geraldine was a figure of fascination in the village, wealthy, perfectly turned out, and trailed by a string of unfortunate men who never seemed to survive her more than 2 years at most. Colonel Whitcomb had been found at precisely 7 o'clock by the butler, Higgs. Dinner had been laid. The drawing-room fire crackled. Yet in the study, there was silence. Higgs had knocked twice, then tried the handle, only to find the door locked. The colonel was slumped in his armchair, a whiskey glass by his right hand, and no sign of a struggle. The only unusual detail, if one could call it that, was a sprig of lavender on the desk, neatly placed atop a sheaf of financial papers. The local constable, young and overawed, had called for Inspector Craddock. Craddock arrived promptly, surveyed the room with a puzzled air, and admitted to himself that he disliked it immensely when a case looked tidy at first glance. A tidy crime, in his experience, meant hidden complications. Heart failure, perhaps, murmured the doctor. But Craddock was not convinced. Men in apparent good health do not expire quietly behind locked doors without some help. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had no intention of intruding, at least not openly. She had always found that people revealed more over tea than under formal questioning. Thus, when Geraldine invited a few close acquaintances to the drawing-room the next afternoon for company, Miss Marple accepted. She observed the widow, immaculate in black, a faint trace of cologne that did not quite mask the faint scent of lavender, and listened as Geraldine spoke of her husband's tragic but peaceful passing. Her composure was remarkable, though she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief at appropriate intervals. The other guests whispered their theories. Some recalled Geraldine's earlier marriages, a hunting accident, a boating mishap, a sudden fever abroad. Tragedies all, but always without scandal. Until now. Craddock had been interviewing staff all day. Higgs swore that no one had entered the study once the colonel went in after luncheon. The maid confirmed she had been polishing silver downstairs. Geraldine herself claimed she had been resting in her room, preparing for dinner. The study had one door, locked from the inside, and a single narrow window opening onto a sheer drop into the rose garden below. No footprints, no ladder marks, nothing to suggest entry or exit. The lavender was troubling. Craddock asked Geraldine about it, and she seemed genuinely puzzled. "My husband detested strong scents," she said lightly, "and I never put flowers in his study." The inspector pocketed the sprig, unsure whether it was a clue or a red herring. Miss Marple, who had happened to overhear this remark, purely by accident, thought of something quite different. In her mind's eye, she recalled Mr. Badger from years ago, who had been so particular about smells that his niece, determined to inherit sooner rather than later, had taken advantage of precisely that. Lavender, Miss Marple knew, could mean more than fragrance. That evening, Craddock sat at the vicarage with his notes spread out, the whole thing gnawing at him. "No poison in the whiskey, no mark of violence," he told Reverend Leonard. "Nothing but that lavender. It's absurd. You can't just put a flower in a room and have a man die of it." Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her corner with her knitting, gave a small cough. People, she remarked gently, do not generally die for no reason at all, and things in a room, locked or not, have a habit of being put there by someone. Craddock frowned. You mean the lavender's a clue? I shouldn't like to say that yet, Miss Marple replied. Only that lavender, in my experience, sometimes comes in more forms than one might expect. Sachets, perfumes, and occasionally, quite concealed, in powder. The inspector was still pondering this when the post-mortem results arrived, traces of digitalis in the colonel's blood. Craddock's mind leapt immediately to the whiskey, but the glass was clean, the decanter untouched. There was no sign of tampering, and yet the colonel had ingested it somehow. By the next morning, the news was all over the village. Poison, they're saying, Mrs. Price Ridley told anyone who would listen. Geraldine remained the picture of composure, though a faint flicker crossed her eyes when the inspector arrived at the house once more. She was willing to answer questions, she said, but it was all too dreadful. Miss Marple visited, ostensibly to bring a small cake for comfort. She asked nothing directly, only listened as Geraldine spoke, her voice even and calm. But Miss Marple's eyes were on the writing desk in the corner, where a small drawer stood slightly ajar. Lavender scent seemed faintly stronger there. A drawer that might, perhaps, hold correspondence or something else entirely. As Miss Marple left the house, she glanced once at the rose garden below the study window. The earth had been recently turned near the base of the wall, though there were no fresh plantings. It was an odd place to disturb the soil in March, odd unless someone had disposed of something small and incriminating, something that might have passed unnoticed until the right moment. That night, Craddock stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. I've got no real evidence, he admitted. No proof she did it, but everything points to her. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and looked at him mildly. Proof is sometimes a matter of looking at what's in plain sight, she said. A sprig of lavender, an unusually tidy crime, and a locked door. All of them speak if you know how to listen. Her eyes, sharp as ever, suggested she already heard quite a lot. The question was whether the inspector would see it too, before the widow of 10 husbands slipped away yet again. Inspector Craddock returned the next morning, looking grimmer than before. His men had combed through the study again, with nothing to show for it but a list of ordinary items. Ledgers, pens, paperweights, a bottle of whiskey. The lavender sprig, now in an evidence envelope, still felt absurdly out of place. Geraldine Whitcomb, poised and perfectly turned out despite her bereavement, had been answering questions in the same even tone, never once contradicting herself. It was the kind of composure Craddock distrusted, though he couldn't yet say why. Miss Marple was there purely by coincidence, or so she allowed others to believe. She had stopped by to bring Higgs some seed cake. He had been most loyal to his employers, she thought, and such loyalty was often rewarded with confidences. While Craddock spoke with Geraldine in the drawing-room, Miss Marple lingered in the hallway, her eyes roving quietly over the small details others did not notice. The brass doorstop by the study door had been moved a fraction to the left, as though someone had nudged it in passing. The umbrella stand contained a pair of boots far too muddy for the season, certainly not worn by the colonel that week. And there was, faintly in the air, that lavender again. Just a whisper, but sharper now, less floral, more medicinal. When Craddock emerged, clearly frustrated, Miss Marple looked up mildly. You've been at it since morning, Inspector. I hope Mrs. Whitcomb has offered you some tea. Craddock gave a brief smile. She's been more than obliging. Almost too obliging, if you ask me. But I can't catch her on anything. Not a slip. People who are too obliging, Miss Marple remarked, are sometimes like curtains drawn just so, meant to hide a room that shouldn't be seen. Craddock hesitated, then motioned toward the study. Would you care to have a look? I can't see what harm it would do. You've got an eye for things. The study was exactly as before. Papers neatly stacked, the colonel's chair still in its place, window fastened shut. On the desk, the blotter was clean save for a faint indentation of writing, perhaps from a letter that had been removed. Miss Marple leaned closer, her fingers lightly grazing the edge. She did not touch anything, but her eyes sharpened at a small smear of powder just visible in the grain of the wood. Her attention shifted to the shelves. Among the rows of books stood a thin volume pushed slightly further back than the rest. She did not remark upon it, but stored the detail away. A misplaced book often meant something. Books rarely went wandering on their own. As she stepped back, her heel brushed against something small on the carpet. A single pearl button, barely visible against the rug's pattern. Not a man's button. Too delicate for that. Miss Marple glanced toward the doorway, where Geraldine's mourning dress had hung perfectly in place, every button accounted for. A spare, or from another garment entirely. She did not stoop to pick it up, only noted it quietly before following Craddock out. In the hallway, Higgs was polishing the banister. Miss Marple paused, chatting pleasantly. "Such a devoted household," she said. "It must have been a terrible shock." "Yes, ma'am," Higgs replied, his voice low. But the colonel was always careful, locked his study as regular as anything, didn't like surprises. He hesitated, glancing toward the drawing room where Geraldine's voice murmured faintly. "Only thing that puzzled me was the way she asked after his papers, right after the doctor came, as if she was worried they'd be misplaced." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled just slightly. People rarely asked after papers when grief was fresh, unless the papers mattered more than they should. That evening, Craddock went over his notes again. "We've got poison, but no means, no fingerprints, no entry, no exit, and that lavender." He trailed off, frowning. Miss Marple sat knitting, her needles clicking softly. "People often see only the thing that shouts the loudest," she said. "But sometimes it is the quiet thing, the thing slightly out of place, that tells the truth. A button where it shouldn't be. A book not quite in line. A question asked too soon." Craddock looked at her sharply. "You saw something." "I saw," Miss Marple replied gently, "only that what appears locked is not always so. Sometimes a door is closed for appearances, and sometimes an open thing is overlooked entirely." The next day, Craddock questioned Geraldine again, pressing her on her movements that afternoon. She maintained her calm answers. Yet, when he asked whether she had been in the study at all, her fingers stilled for just a fraction of a second on the lace of her handkerchief. It was so small a pause that any ordinary eye might have missed it. But Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, did not. Later, as Geraldine escorted them out, Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more toward the writing desk. Faint line of dust on the surface suggested something had been removed very recently. Something small, square perhaps, that had sat there undisturbed for some time. By now, the picture in Miss Marple's mind was forming, though not yet complete. A locked room, a sprig of lavender, a button, a missing object. The pattern was there, hidden in plain sight. It was merely a matter of waiting until the last piece revealed itself. Inspector Craddock began his interviews in earnest the following morning, summoning the household staff one by one to the morning room. Miss Marple, ostensibly there to help soothe Geraldine with a comforting presence, sat unobtrusively in a high-backed chair with her knitting. No one seemed to mind her. After all, a quiet old lady with a ball of soft pink wool hardly appeared threatening. Higgs came first. His account was steady. He had laid the table, announced dinner at the proper time, and gone to fetch the colonel when the hour grew late. But under Craddock's measured questioning, a small inconsistency emerged. "You said you knocked twice before trying the handle?" Craddock asked. "Yes, sir." "Twice," Higgs said. But a moment later, when describing the panic that followed, he added, "After the third knock, I knew something was wrong. It was nothing on its own, but Miss Marple caught the slip and stored it away. People who were precise about numbers generally kept to them, unless nerves were at play. Next came Lucy, the maid, a quiet girl with downcast eyes. She insisted she had been in the kitchen polishing silver. Yet when Craddock asked if she had seen anyone pass the study door that afternoon, she hesitated a fraction too long before saying no. "You're sure of that?" Craddock pressed. Lucy's fingers twisted at her apron. I didn't see anyone, sir. I heard footsteps, maybe. But I can't say who. It might have been Mrs. Whitcomb going to her room. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "My dear, do you mean the stairs creak a bit when someone goes up?" Lucy's face colored. "Yes, ma'am. The second step from the top. Always does. But I only heard it once that day." "Only once," Miss Marple repeated softly, and returned to her needles. Geraldine herself entered with graceful composure, her morning dress flawless, the same faint scent of lavender clinging about her. She answered each of Craddock's questions with practiced calm. She had been in her room preparing for dinner. She had not seen the Colonel after luncheon. She had not entered the study at all. "Not at all," Craddock said, his eyes steady on hers. Geraldine smiled faintly. "I believe I've already told you, Inspector. My husband valued his privacy." Miss Marple watched carefully. Geraldine's voice was smooth, but she had made one curious error. "Valued his privacy," she had said, not "valued it." It was a small slip into the past tense before decorum required it. That was the kind of thing most people would miss. After Geraldine came Mrs. Price Ridley, who had not been in the house at all, but nonetheless offered her own account in tones of authority. She claimed to have seen Geraldine on the garden path shortly before the Colonel's death, wearing a lighter dress, not her present black. "Silk, I think," Mrs. Price Ridley said with satisfaction, "and no gloves." Craddock frowned. "But Mrs. Whitcomb says she was in her room." "Well," Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed, "perhaps she went there after. One does want to be tidy before dinner." Her statement was shaky, but Miss Marple tucked it away. Changing clothes unexpectedly often meant more than vanity. The last to be questioned was Mr. Harding, the Colonel's solicitor, summoned from London. His account was straightforward. He had been corresponding with the Colonel regarding certain investments. "He asked me to prepare some papers," Harding explained. "I sent them over by post earlier that week. We were due to review them next month." "Were they important papers?" Miss Marple asked mildly, her needles clicking. Harding hesitated. "Well, yes. Rather significant, in fact. Changes to the will." That made Craddock glance up sharply. "Changes. Yes, though the final draft was not yet signed. It would have altered certain bequests, Mrs. Whitcomb's share among others." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Do you know if Mrs. Whitcomb was aware of these changes?" Harding gave a small shrug. He had not discussed them with her, at least not in my presence. Miss Marple said nothing, but her thoughts ran quickly. A widow losing part of her inheritance might have motive enough, but motives alone were not proof, and Geraldine's composure remained unshaken. That evening, Craddock and Miss Marple sat again at the vicarage, comparing notes. "She's too perfect," Craddock said, pacing. "Not a slip, not a flaw, except perhaps that Mrs. Price Ridley swears she saw her in the garden." "Mrs. Price Ridley," Miss Marple said softly, "has a tendency to embroider, but even embroidery can contain a thread of truth. A change of clothing, for instance, is often a very telling thing." Craddock looked at her. "You think she changed her dress?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that one does not often change silk for mourning black unless something has been spilled, or someone wishes to appear to have been somewhere they were not." "And the lavender?" Craddock pressed. Miss Marple's needles paused just long enough to suggest she was thinking carefully. "Lavender can mask many scents, but sometimes," she added, "it is there not to conceal, but to remind. The question is, Remind whom of what? In the Whitcomb household, the air felt charged in the days that followed. The staff went about their duties quietly, but there was a tension beneath their words. Lucy avoided Geraldine's gaze. Higgs polished the silver with unnecessary vigor. Geraldine remained the picture of dignity, but there was a sharpness now in her tone when she spoke to Craddock, as though patience were wearing thin. It was on the third day, when Craddock mentioned the will again, that Miss Marple noticed something new. Geraldine's hands, so steady before, trembled just slightly as she folded her handkerchief. Her voice did not falter, but her eyes flickered, ever so briefly, toward the writing desk in the study. A glance at the desk revealed nothing overt, but to Miss Marple, the smallest reaction was often the most telling of all. She said nothing, only filed it away with the button, the lavender, the creaking stair, and the book pushed too far back. The voices had spoken, each in their own way, each with their own omissions. Contradictions, half-truths, and too perfect answers had begun to form the outline of the truth. It was only a matter of time before the pattern would emerge in full. Inspector Craddock's notes were beginning to look more like a spider's web than an orderly investigation. Each name connected to another by lines of possible motive, some faint, some bold. None of them pointed to a single, neat solution. Miss Marple sat across from him at the vicarage, her knitting in her lap, glancing at the growing diagram. "It is rather like a badly made jumper," she observed. "Too many loose threads, and every time you think you've tidied one away, another appears." Craddock frowned. "Geraldine has motive, the will, but she's got no opportunity that we can prove. Higgs could have slipped in with the drinks tray, but there's nothing to tie him to the poison." Lucy heard footsteps, but her fear might be nothing more than being caught in some small household mischief, and Mrs. Price Ridley is not nearly as important as she thinks she is, Miss Marple finished dryly. "Though people who talk too much often reveal things they don't intend." The inspector tapped his pencil. "And Harding, the solicitor, he benefits if Geraldine gets her full inheritance, but that's circumstantial at best." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "It is rare that only one motive exists. People are more complicated than that, Inspector. They often have several small reasons to do something, and one decisive reason that tips the balance. But that decisive reason is not always the one they will admit to." Back at the Whitcomb house, the atmosphere seemed heavier, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. Miss Marple made her rounds, seemingly in the spirit of an old lady concerned with propriety, but quietly noting the cracks beneath the surface. Higgs was loyal, but loyalty could be bought or threatened. His recent purchase of an expensive watch had not gone unnoticed. When Miss Marple complimented it, he flushed deeply and muttered about a lucky win on the horses. Miss Marple only nodded. Lucy, when pressed gently about the footsteps, admitted she had been afraid of speaking plainly. "Mrs. Whitcomb, she doesn't like people to notice things, and I thought maybe it wasn't my place." She wouldn't say more, but her eyes betrayed unease. Geraldine maintained her perfect poise. She spoke of her grief, her respect for her late husband, her confusion at the police attention. But when Craddock mentioned Harding again, her expression cooled just slightly, and she shifted the conversation to the household accounts. It was deftly done, but a deflection nonetheless. Harding himself, summoned once more, seemed almost too careful in his statements. He reiterated that the will had not been finalized, but there was a subtle emphasis on the fact that the unsigned draft was missing. "If it's gone," he said, "then the earlier will stand. Mrs. Whitcomb retains her full share." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Convenient." Harding spread his hands. "Only a fact, Inspector. Nothing more." As the day wore on, the motives began to knot further. Greed was evident. Geraldine's inheritance, Harding's potential benefit through her, even Higgs's sudden spending. But there were other undercurrents. Fear, for instance. Lucy's hesitations were not those of a guilty party, but of someone worried about what she might reveal. And there was the question of the garden siding. If Mrs. Price Ridley had seen Geraldine outside, why conceal it? It was Miss Marple who began quietly pulling the threads together. "Let us look at what cannot be," she said to Craddock. "The poison had to enter the Colonel's system inside that study. We know the door was locked, or seemed to be. We know no one was seen going in. But we also know someone was in the garden. We know there was lavender in the room, and we know a button was on the carpet. Each of these tells a small story." Craddock frowned. "You think the button is important?" "My dear Inspector, in my experience, buttons are almost always important. They come off at moments of haste or struggle, and silk dresses often have them. Now, why would a lady in a silk dress be in the garden just before dinner, and why would she change so quickly after?" Craddock began to pace. If she changed, it could have been to hide something, but she'd still need a way into the study without being seen. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "A locked room, Inspector, is only as locked as one wishes it to appear. There are other ways in, ways one might not notice if one was thinking only of doors and windows." Piece by piece, the web of motives began to take shape. Geraldine's motive was clear. Financial and perhaps personal, if there was more behind her calm mask than grief. Harding's motive was indirect but tempting. Higgs's sudden expenses hinted at either bribery or hush money. Lucy's fear suggested knowledge that might be dangerous to her. And Mrs. Price Ridley, whether intentionally or not, had introduced the idea of Geraldine outside, which Miss Marple thought unlikely to be entirely invented. What remained was the means, and that, Miss Marple suspected, was where all these motives, tangled though they were, would align. She said nothing more that evening, only rose, gathered her knitting, and announced to Craddock, "I believe we have reached the point, Inspector, where the truth is very close indeed. We have but to tug the right thread, and the whole thing will unravel." It was late the next afternoon when the first real jolt of excitement swept through Inspector Craddock's team. A constable, rummaging through the storage closet off the Whitcomb pantry, came across a small bottle tucked behind a jar of preserves. Its label was worn, but the faint letters spelled digitalis. Craddock's eyes sharpened immediately. Foxglove poison, the same substance found in Colonel Whitcomb's teacup. Higgs was summoned at once. His face went ashen the moment the bottle appeared on the table. "I've never seen that before, sir," he stammered. "I don't go rummaging in the preserves." "It was in your charge," Craddock said curtly. "Your pantry, your responsibility." The search of Higgs's quarters turned up more, an envelope containing a sum of money far beyond a butler's modest savings, hidden in the lining of his coat. The coincidence was damning. The announcement traveled quickly. By evening, the local paper had word of an arrest imminent. Mrs. Price Ridley was already telling the grocer how she had suspected Higgs from the very start. Lucy, pale and wide-eyed, avoided everyone's gaze. Geraldine maintained her dignified composure, though a certain looseness crept into her voice, as if the strain she had been under was lifting. At the vicarage, Craddock sat with a triumphant gleam in his eye. "Open and shut, Miss Marple. The man had both the poison and the money. The Colonel was a hard master, from what I've gathered. It's the sort of servant's revenge one reads about." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. "Yes," she said mildly. "One does read about such things. Quite often, in fact. Almost too often." Craddock frowned. "You don't think it's him?" "I think, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, resuming her knitting, "that the pantry is a most inconvenient place to hide poison if one wishes it never to be found. It is, however, a most convenient place to hide it if one wishes it to be found by the police, especially if the person so accused is unlikely to be able to defend himself." Craddock sat back, scowling. "Planted evidence, you mean?" "It has been known," Miss Marple said gently. "In my village, a Mrs. Ellerton once placed a bottle of rum in her husband's shed to convince the neighbors he was a secret drinker. It worked for a time until one realized that Mr. Ellerton never much liked rum, and Mrs. Ellerton stood to inherit his beehives." "But the money," Craddock protested. "Indeed, money is even more easily planted than poison." Her eyes twinkled, though there was nothing frivolous in her tone. "The question, my dear Inspector, is not whether these things were found in Higgs's possession, but who might have wished them to be there. Still, the machinery of official procedure ground on. Higgs was brought into custody, protesting his innocence. His statements were disjointed but consistent. He had no idea how the bottle or the money had come into his pantry. His solicitor urged him to keep silent until formal charges were made. Geraldine seemed more at ease than she had been in days. "It is a sad business," she told Miss Marple, her voice touched with melancholy. "But I suppose justice must be done. Poor Higgs. One never really knows people, does one?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes unreadable. "Sometimes one knows them better than they know themselves, my dear. Sometimes one sees their habits so well, one knows when they're out of place. That can be instructive." Lucy's relief at Higgs's arrest was less convincing. She flinched at questions, glancing toward Geraldine before answering. Her hands twisted her apron until the fabric threatened to tear. Miss Marple noted it all, as unobtrusively as she always did. The press declared the case all but solved by the following morning. Yet Craddock was not entirely at ease. Miss Marple's words had lodged themselves in his mind, irritating as grit in a shoe. There was the matter of the locked room, still unexplained. The matter of the button on the carpet, still unaccounted for. And the matter of Mrs. Price Ridley's sighting in the garden, which neatly failed to fit the picture of a butler's revenge. That evening, as Craddock reviewed his notes yet again, Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "You have the makings of a very fine inspector, my dear," she said kindly, "but you must be careful of neat solutions that arrive too soon. Real life is untidier than novels, and the truth often waits until everyone has stopped looking for it." Craddock sighed. "You think we've stopped too soon?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that whoever killed Colonel Whitcomb has not finished what they set out to do. They are very confident, Inspector. Confident enough to plant evidence, confident enough to watch as an innocent man is accused. But such confidence, in my experience, often means there is one last thing they need to accomplish. And that means," she added softly, "that they will act again." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the branches against the study window of the Whitcomb house. Inside, Geraldine poured herself a measured glass of sherry, her expression calm, her eyes distant. The case, in the public mind, was over. But in the quiet mind of Miss Marple, the real criminal was still at large, waiting for the right moment to strike. The false calm that followed Higgs's arrest lasted barely 2 days before the past began to seep into the case like damp through old plaster. Miss Marple, who never let apparent conclusions lull her into comfort, had returned to the Whitcomb Library, not to rifle through documents, but to sit quietly in a faded armchair, her eyes roving over the room as though it were a tapestry. It was there, while Geraldine was out walking with Harding, that she noticed a faint indentation on the Colonel's desk, a square outline where something once rested for many years. It was now gone. Curiosity piqued, she inquired of Lucy, who admitted, after some hesitation, that an old photograph had always stood there, the Colonel as a young officer, flanked by 2 other men in uniform. "It was taken in India," Lucy said. "The frame was silver, but Mrs. Whitcomb had it removed after the Colonel's death. She said it was too painful to look at." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Grief is often selective, my dear. Do you recall the names of the other gentlemen?" Lucy shook her head, but the mention of India set Miss Marple thinking. Colonel Whitcomb's service years were not a topic often raised in St. Mary Mead, but she remembered a small scandal from long ago involving a procurement scandal in the Punjab. A missing consignment of army funds, rumors of bribes, and 3 officers quietly retired. That evening at the vicarage, she asked Craddock to humor her with a discreet inquiry. "I've always found, Inspector, that the sins of youth often explain the tragedies of age. People do not change so very much. They simply become better at concealing the same weaknesses." Craddock grumbled, but by the next morning he had the information. Colonel Whitcomb had indeed served in India with 2 other officers. Major Gerald Harding, yes, the same Harding who now served as solicitor, and Captain Edward Mallory, long since deceased. Harding's role in the procurement scandal had been quietly hushed. Whitcomb had testified in his favor at a military inquiry. Craddock sat back heavily. So Harding owed Whitcomb a debt. Doesn't sound like a motive for murder. "On the contrary," Miss Marple murmured. "Old debts, like old secrets, can be a form of leash. They chafe, particularly if one's benefactor is inclined to use them." It was then she asked to see the Colonel's correspondence. Most letters were mundane, club notices, invitations, accounts. But one slim bundle caught her attention. It was tied neatly with faded ribbon, the handwriting on the envelopes faint but legible. To Geraldine, from a C.M. The letters were decades old, predating her marriage. Miss Marple read just enough to sense an attachment, emotional, perhaps romantic, that had never quite gone away. A conversation with Mrs. Price Ridley, who never needed prompting to gossip, filled in the rest. "Oh yes, my dear, Geraldine was quite the belle in her day. There was a Mr. Charles Mallory, handsome as sin. But the Whitcombs' marriage put an end to that. Charles went abroad, India, I believe. Died there. Tragic, really. Charles Mallory. Edward Mallory's brother. And so a different shape began to form in Miss Marple's mind. Harding, indebted to Whitcomb. Geraldine, once attached to Charles Mallory. The Colonel, holding a long memory of both men, and perhaps the means to use their past against them. A triangle of old connections, bound by loyalty, betrayal, and silence. She said nothing to Craddock immediately. She preferred to test her theories in the small ways she always did. That afternoon she contrived to join Geraldine for tea. Her manner was pleasant, even soothing. They spoke of gardens, church matters, and the weather, until Miss Marple remarked, almost idly, "How kind of Mr. Harding to remain so steadfast a friend after all these years. Not many men would maintain such loyalty to their late comrade's family." For a moment, no more than a flicker, Geraldine's teacup halted mid-air. "Gerald has always been a friend," she said evenly. "One must value such constancy." "Indeed one must," Miss Marple agreed. "It reminds me so of my friend Mrs. Larkin, whose husband was so very devoted to her, even after she chose another." She looked over her glasses with an innocent smile. "Though such histories are sometimes best kept in the past, are they not?" Geraldine's eyes cooled, but she said nothing further. Miss Marple left the Whitcomb house certain of one thing. The murder of Colonel Whitcomb was not merely about his fortune or his present household. It was tied to something much older, something that had begun decades ago in India, in the company of Harding and the Mallory brothers, and someone, perhaps more than one someone, had been waiting a very long time for the past to stop casting its shadow. Miss Marple had always believed that when reason reached its limits, human nature could still be relied upon, and human nature, she reflected, could be tested in the most unassuming ways. That afternoon, she asked Craddock for a small favor. Not the kind that involved warrants or interrogations, but the sort of thing that, as she put it, is entirely in keeping with neighborly civility. She wanted, quite simply, a gathering at the Whitcomb house. Nothing grand, just tea for a select few. Geraldine, Harding, Lucy, and Mrs. Price Ridley. Craddock looked dubious. "You're planning a tea party?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. I've always found tea to be an excellent solvent for the truth. People's masks slip when they think they are merely being social, and with a few carefully chosen words, one can see exactly where the cracks are. By the following afternoon, the group was assembled in the drawing room. Geraldine presided with her usual poise. Harding remained politely guarded. Lucy kept to the edges, and Mrs. Price Ridley positioned herself like a general waiting for the enemy to make a move. Miss Marple's unusual tactic began not with accusations, but with reminiscence. She told a gentle, meandering story about an old acquaintance in her village, a story that, in its bones, mirrored the connections between Whitcomb, Harding, and the Mallory brothers. "It is the most curious thing," she said, her knitting needles clicking softly. "This dear friend of mine married a gentleman who had once served abroad, and he, in turn, had a great friend who was always, how shall I put it, indebted to him. But debts, like old photographs, sometimes fade unless one takes care to refresh them. And sometimes, my dears, they are kept very much alive." Geraldine's hand tightened on her teacup. Harding's gaze shifted ever so slightly to her. Miss Marple went on as though she hadn't noticed. "It came to pass that this gentleman discovered certain letters, keepsakes, you know, and it caused a great deal of unpleasantness. Of course, one wonders whether such letters were truly harmless, or whether they might have been, shall we say, insurance." There was the smallest clink as Harding set down his cup. "Are we discussing your acquaintance, Miss Marple, or are we in danger of wandering into gossip?" His tone was smooth, but his shoulders had stiffened. "Oh, purely my acquaintance," Miss Marple said sweetly. "But isn't it interesting how the past never really stays buried? A letter here, a memory there, and suddenly everything is alive again. It reminds me so much of India, how certain stories resurface, no matter how much time passes." Harding's expression froze. Geraldine, though silent, leaned back with the faintest look of discomfort, her eyes darting to Lucy. Miss Marple, apparently oblivious, reached into her knitting bag and drew out a small object, the silver photograph frame, recently polished. "I happened upon this in the pantry cupboard. Imagine that. I thought it would be nice to restore it to its rightful place. Such a handsome group. Colonel Whitcomb, of course, Major Harding, and—" She paused delicately. "Mr. Charles Mallory. Quite the striking trio." It was Harding who reacted first. His lips tightened as though he meant to speak, but no words came. Geraldine's eyes went cold, her composure turning rigid. Lucy, however, let out a small, involuntary sound, half gasp, half sob, and covered her mouth. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "My dear Lucy, you recognize this photograph?" Lucy's fingers twisted in her lap. "Only, I saw it once before. Mrs. Whitcomb. She told me never to mention it. She said—" Lucy faltered, then lowered her eyes. "She said it brought back unpleasant things." Miss Marple nodded slightly, as though this were the mildest confirmation. "How very considerate of her." Her gaze flicked briefly toward Geraldine, who sat perfectly still. It was all there, subtle but unmistakable. Harding's discomfort, Geraldine's sudden chill, Lucy's fearful obedience. The photograph, an ordinary household item to anyone else, had acted like a match to dry tinder. When the tea ended, Miss Marple excused herself with her usual politeness, leaving the room feeling oddly heavy with things unsaid. Outside, Craddock caught her eye. "Well," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "Exactly as I hoped, Inspector. When people have nothing to conceal, they smile at old photographs. When they have much to conceal, they forget themselves. That, my dear Inspector, is how one separates the innocent from the guilty. We are quite ready now for the next step." The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, intending to pay another visit to the Whitcomb house before the ripple from her tea party had fully settled. She suspected that someone in that household had spent the night thinking and worrying. She was right. When she arrived, she found the study in a state of quiet disarray. The air smelled faintly of charred paper, as though the fireplace had been used recently. Lucy, flustered, explained that Mrs. Whitcomb had decided to tidy away some of the Colonel's old things. A few unnecessary letters and documents, she said, had been burned for the sake of clearing space. Miss Marple, in her gentle way, asked if the photograph had been restored to its rightful place. Lucy hesitated, then admitted it was missing. Mrs. Whitcomb said it looked worn and had asked Major Harding to take it for cleaning. Craddock, who had joined them a moment later, swore under his breath. First the letters, now the photograph? That's not tidying up, that's tampering. Miss Marple looked thoughtful rather than angry. "It is most unfortunate," she said, peering toward the hearth, "particularly as so many of those old papers might have been enlightening. It does make one wonder who gains from such a clearance." By afternoon, the missing photograph was not the only concern. Craddock, who had requested the return of the Colonel's correspondence from the evidence room, discovered that one envelope, the one from Charles Mallory, was gone. No record of its removal, no explanation. "This is deliberate," he muttered to Miss Marple. "Someone is removing anything that ties Geraldine or Harding to the Colonel's past." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with quiet satisfaction. "Which means, dear Inspector, that we are very much on the right trail. The guilty always grow nervous when their past is threatened." Still, she knew the danger. When evidence vanished, cases faltered and suspects grew bolder. Whoever had removed the photograph and the letter understood that time was running short, and that someone had enough access and enough confidence to act openly. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected caller, Mrs. Price Ridley, breathless and indignant. "Miss Marple, you won't believe it. Major Harding was in the Whitcomb house after dark. Lucy said she thought he was there to see Mrs. Whitcomb, but I saw him slip into the study. He left in rather a hurry." "Such goings-on, my dear." Miss Marple merely folded her hands. "So the Major has taken an interest in the Colonel's study. Again." The next morning brought worse news. The contents of the Colonel's locked desk drawer, his private diary, were gone. Not a single entry remained. Craddock, furious, began questioning the household. But Miss Marple stopped him with a raised hand. "You will not retrieve the diary by shouting, Inspector. Whoever has taken it is perfectly capable of destroying it. But if one removes a piece from a pattern, the absence itself becomes part of the design." Craddock frowned. Meaning, she said calmly, "that the thief cannot erase every trace. The contents of that diary touched someone's nerve so strongly they risked everything to destroy it. We must consider, what could the Colonel have written that was dangerous in life and fatal in death? The vanishing evidence changed everything. Now there was more at stake than the truth of a decades-old scandal. There was an active hand working against them, silencing the past before it could speak. And in such a game, trust became the rarest commodity. Even Lucy, so timid and obliging, now looked at Miss Marple with a shadow of fear, as though unsure which confidences were safe. Harding's politeness had sharpened into guardedness. Geraldine's calm had frozen into something close to hostility. Miss Marple, undeterred, only smiled faintly to herself. The hand that swept evidence from the table had also revealed itself, and that, she thought, was always the beginning of the end. It was just past 8 the next morning when Inspector Craddock appeared at Miss Marple's guest-house door, his face grim. "There's been another incident," he said without preamble. "Major Harding, found at the Whitcomb house. Dead." Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her pale eyes sharp. "How very hasty of him," she murmured, "and how very inconvenient for the truth." The scene at the Whitcomb residence was curiously quiet. Harding's body lay slumped in the colonel's study, the very room where evidence had been vanishing piece by piece. A decanter sat on the desk beside two glasses, one overturned. The medical officer murmured about poison, swift, efficient. Geraldine, immaculately dressed even in her distress, stood nearby, her grief contained in a brittle composure. Major Harding came to discuss some papers the colonel had entrusted to him. I left them for a few minutes, and when I returned, her voice trailed off. Lucy hovered in the doorway, pale as chalk, as though afraid to cross the threshold. Mrs. Price Ridley, naturally, was already whispering to anyone who would listen about Harding's supposed secrets and debts. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "This changes everything. Whoever killed Whitcomb, or had him killed, just tied off another loose end. Harding must have known something. This could point straight to Geraldine." Miss Marple tilted her head, studying Geraldine's rigid stance. "Or it could point to someone who very much wishes us to think so." The second crime shifted the air like a sudden change in wind. Harding's death was too clean, too timely. It erased a man who might have explained the missing diary, the vanished photograph, the letter from Charles Mallory. But it also complicated matters. If Harding had been the culprit, why kill him now? Craddock ordered the room sealed, but Miss Marple knew that the killer was ahead of them as before. Evidence would be scarce. Motives tangled. That afternoon a strange thing happened. A note arrived for Miss Marple at the guest house, slipped under her door. No signature, just 6 words in an elegant, looping hand. "Stop asking questions, or you will follow." Craddock wanted to increase security, but Miss Marple waved it away. "Threats are most encouraging, Inspector. They mean the culprit feels pressed, and if they are willing to threaten me, it suggests they are running out of safer methods." Still, the danger was real. Harding's death proved the villain was not only active, but willing to strike again. And in a house where every guest had a motive and the past was full of dangerous secrets, the next target could be anyone. Miss Marple's task was no longer just to uncover the truth. It was to prevent another death. And that meant springing the trap before the killer struck again. The house had fallen into an uneasy silence after Harding's death. But Miss Marple knew silence was rarely a sign of peace. It was the sound of people holding their breath. Craddock, restless, spent the day re-examining interviews, but the threads still looked tangled. "We've got too many possible motives and no straight line between them," he muttered over tea. Geraldine benefits from the colonel's death. Harding's gone before he can talk. Lucy's scared of something, and Price Ridley knows more than she's saying. It's all knots. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, gazing out at the neat garden of the guest house. "Knots, Inspector, are only confusing if one doesn't see the pattern they tie. And I think, just perhaps, it is starting to show itself. It came not from a confession, nor a piece of physical evidence, but from a small thing, a sentence Geraldine had spoken almost without thinking. During the tea party days before, Geraldine had said, "The colonel never kept letters. He hated clutter." At the time, it had sounded perfectly ordinary. But Harding's presence in the study, the destruction of papers, the missing diary, all of it contradicted that statement. Why lie about something so trivial unless it wasn't trivial at all? Miss Marple remembered something else too. The photograph in the silver frame, tucked away in the pantry cupboard. That wasn't just clutter. It was concealment. Someone had been deliberately controlling what from the colonel's past was visible and what was hidden. And then there was Lucy's reaction to the photograph, and her whispered admission. She told me never to mention it. Who? Geraldine. The pattern sharpened. Geraldine had consistently tried to rewrite what people remembered of the colonel, his friendships, his possessions, his habits. Harding's death removed the man most likely to contradict her. And yet, Miss Marple hesitated. Geraldine was careful, yes, but careful people didn't usually act so quickly and so dangerously. Her eyes drifted to Lucy, timid and quiet, always in the background. Lucy had been the one to open the study for Harding. Lucy had been the one to notice objects missing or moved. Lucy, who always seemed so nervous, like someone who knew she was living close to fire. An idea flickered. What if Lucy wasn't simply frightened? What if she was being directed? A pawn moving pieces for someone clever enough to remain unseen. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the Whitcomb house under the pretext of retrieving a dropped handkerchief. She wandered, harmlessly, as everyone thought, into the study. There, she noticed a detail that crystallized everything. A faint ring on the desk where a heavy object had once stood. An object exactly the size of the missing silver frame. It wasn't that the frame had been cleaned or put away. It had been taken, and not by Harding. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mind weaving the final threads. Someone had been erasing the Colonel's connections, but also controlling how they disappeared. Harding had been silenced, but not until after he'd served his purpose. The vanished diary, the burned papers, the photograph, all taken at points when suspicion could plausibly shift. A picture formed not of a series of random cover-ups, but of a deliberate, staged sequence. Someone had been orchestrating not just the concealment of evidence, but the appearance of frantic concealment. And for the first time, Miss Marple saw the hand that had been in plain sight all along. She folded her gloves neatly, her mind quite settled. "Patterns are so much tidier than people think, Inspector," she murmured to herself as she stepped out of the study. And when one sees the full design, the knot unravels at once. The next evening, Miss Marple sat in the Whitcomb drawing room with Geraldine, Lucy, and Inspector Craddock. The air was taut, though Geraldine maintained her poised facade, while Lucy looked pale and restless. Miss Marple began conversationally, as though discussing nothing more pressing than the weather. It's such a curious thing, how patterns emerge from the smallest threads. One sees a photograph tucked away, a letter gone missing, a diary removed, and one wonders why the same careful hand touches them all. Geraldine smiled thinly. "Surely you don't think these trifles point to anything sinister, Miss Marple?" "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as lace. "It is the trifles that point to everything. You see, the Colonel's papers were not destroyed simply because they contained secrets. They were destroyed because those secrets threatened something much older and far more dangerous than a question of inheritance." Craddock leaned forward, alert now. "Older how?" Miss Marple looked to Lucy, who had grown still, her hands clenched in her lap. The motive was never money. Not truly. It was protection, and protection, Inspector, is a most powerful incentive for crime. Colonel Whitcomb's past was complicated. He was not the sort of man who inspired simple affection, but he did inspire loyalty. From some. Dangerous loyalty. Geraldine's composure tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her gaze fixed gently on Lucy. "When the Colonel married Geraldine, he brought more than a wife into his life. He brought a family connection, someone from her side who owed him more than gratitude, someone whose position, whose very reputation, could be ruined by the wrong letter or the wrong word, and so, certain letters had to vanish. Certain mentions in his diary had to be erased. And when Major Harding threatened to speak, well, he had to be silenced." Lucy's breath came in shallow bursts now. "I didn't," she whispered. Miss Marple's tone never sharpened, but her words pressed like a slow tide. "Oh, my dear, you did not do this for yourself. You did it for someone you loved, someone who had protected you once. That is why you worked so quietly, why you feared being caught, and why you hesitated even when the risk was greatest. The motive was never greed, it was loyalty. And loyalty is a dangerous blade when wielded for the wrong person." Geraldine's eyes flickered toward Lucy, just for a moment, but it was enough. Craddock saw it too. Miss Marple sat back, her voice quiet but steady. The Colonel knew something from before Geraldine's marriage, something that could destroy her. He had kept it, I think, as a means of control. When Harding began asking questions, that secret was in danger of surfacing. And so, piece by piece, the evidence was removed. Not for wealth, not for status, but to protect the one person Geraldine could not afford to see ruined. The room was still. And then, slowly, Lucy broke. "She's my sister," she whispered, her eyes on Geraldine. "She's all I've got. He was going to ruin her, bring it all out. I couldn't let him. I thought if I just got rid of the letters, the diary, if Harding went away, it would all stop." Geraldine's silence was as telling as any confession. Miss Marple sighed softly. Such love, such loyalty, and such tragedy. But crimes committed for love are still crimes, my dear. And in protecting someone so fiercely, one often ends by destroying them instead. The motive was no longer a matter of inheritance or jealousy. It was the desperate protection of a bond forged long before the Colonel's final days. And in that revelation, the full cruelty of the case became clear. The crime had been born not of hatred, but of devotion that had turned dark. It was a quiet evening at the Whitcomb house, but the quiet was deceptive. Every detail had been arranged with deliberate care. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in hand, while Inspector Craddock lingered in the hall, waiting. The sisters, Geraldine and Lucy, had been invited on the pretense of one final discussion to settle the matter of the Colonel's affairs. Miss Marple had set her stage with precision. On the table sat the silver photograph frame, restored to its place. Inside it, however, was not the Colonel's picture, but a copy of a letter Miss Marple had painstakingly reconstructed from fragments Harding had hidden in his personal papers. Details the police had kept secret until now. The letter hinted at the Colonel's knowledge of Geraldine's past scandal and how he intended to use it should the need arise. Geraldine entered first, her posture as poised as ever, but there was tension in her hands. Lucy followed close behind, glancing at the photograph with dread before quickly looking away. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I thought it would be proper to return the Colonel's effects to their rightful place. One must preserve the truth, after all." Geraldine's eyes lingered on the letter in the frame. "That letter doesn't belong there," she said, her voice even. "Oh?" Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking softly. "It seems such a curious little thing, does it not? A letter the Colonel valued enough to keep hidden. Remarkable what one can piece together from seemingly destroyed scraps." Lucy's breathing grew faster. "You said it was all over," she whispered to Geraldine. Miss Marple glanced up mildly. "Over? I'm afraid not, my dear. In fact, I believe it is just about to begin. You see, that letter was the keystone to the Colonel's control. Without it, he had little hold over anyone. But the person who destroyed the original, who ensured Harding could not reveal its contents, why, they must have believed removing the threat would end the danger. And yet here we are." Craddock stepped into the room then, closing the door behind him. Geraldine's expression hardened. "You have no proof, just a letter cobbled together and insinuations." Miss Marple set down her knitting, her voice still gentle. "Proof is a curious thing, my dear. It is rarely the single dramatic item. It is the pattern, the diary that vanished, the photograph hidden, the papers destroyed, the sequence of these acts, each one occurring just as suspicion could have fallen in a dangerous direction. That is orchestration, Geraldine. And Lucy, poor child, was merely the instrument." Lucy broke, tears running down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for Harding to die. I only wanted to keep her safe. I burned the diary because she told me it would ruin everything." "Lucy!" Geraldine snapped, but it was too late. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low but clear. "And yet, my dear Geraldine, you knew Lucy would do it. You knew she would do anything for you. That is why you never dirtied your own hands, except when Harding had to be silenced. Poison is such an efficient tool, is it not? And so much easier for someone who knows the exact moment to strike. Geraldine's face was pale now, but her voice was icy. You think you've won, but you have nothing a court would accept. Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly. Oh, I think we have quite enough. Harding's glass has been tested. The residue matches the Colonel's own store of bitter almonds, and, most tellingly, only you knew the decanter had been replaced. You were overheard by the maid on the very morning of his visit. The silence stretched, tight as wire. Geraldine's eyes flickered to the door. Just a fraction, but Craddock was already there. She straightened, a bitter laugh escaping her. So this is how it ends. I was cleverer than the Colonel, cleverer than Harding, and now I'm undone by a meddling old woman with knitting needles. Miss Marple regarded her evenly. It is so often the way, my dear. People underestimate how much one sees when one listens, and how much one understands when one has seen it all before. Geraldine's shoulders sank. For a moment she looked less like the perfect society widow and more like a woman who had been carrying a dangerous weight for far too long. It was all for nothing then, she murmured. Miss Marple said nothing, for there was nothing more to say. Craddock stepped forward, taking Geraldine into custody, while Lucy sat frozen, pale and trembling. As the door closed behind them, Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. The pattern was complete. The next morning, the Whitcomb case seemed finished. Geraldine had been taken into custody, Lucy placed under the sympathetic watch of her solicitor, and Inspector Craddock was completing the final paperwork. The quiet in the village returned as though a storm had passed. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her tea, might have allowed herself a moment of contentment, if not for one small, nagging detail. It was the sort of thing others would dismiss, but she knew better than to ignore loose threads. It was Harding's watch. The police had catalogued it after his death, an ordinary silver piece cracked across the face. Craddock had noted the time had stopped at 8:47. Officially, this was taken as the moment Harding collapsed after drinking the poisoned port. But Harding's body had been found in the library, and the decanter had been poured there, meaning he must have died almost immediately. Yet Miss Marple remembered Harding passing through the garden at 8:30, stopping to speak to the gardener for a quarter of an hour before he went in. That meant the library scene had been staged, and by someone still in the house after Geraldine's arrest. She set down her teacup. By noon, she was at the Whitcomb estate again. Lucy was there, pale but calmer, preparing to leave under her solicitor's care. But Miss Marple's attention was not on Lucy. It was on the solicitor himself, Mr. Finlay. He was an unremarkable man, the sort easily overlooked. And yet, as he reached for Lucy's travel case, Miss Marple noticed the faint outline of a familiar crest on the leather, a crest that matched Harding's family seal. "Oh dear," Miss Marple said, almost apologetically. What a curious piece of luggage for you to carry, Mr. Finlay. I should have thought Lucy's belongings would be in her own case. Finlay froze for just a second too long." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Of course. Harding left a great many documents unaccounted for, did he not? And you were his legal advisor before he came here. You must have known what was in those papers, enough to see what danger they posed to your other clients. Clients like Geraldine." Lucy's eyes widened. "Mr. Finlay." Finlay straightened, his bland face tightening. "You've no idea what you're meddling in, Miss Marple. Geraldine was reckless, yes, but she was also a liability. Harding would have exposed her, and in doing so, he'd have exposed half the people I represent. I couldn't allow that." Miss Marple's voice was mild but unwavering. "So you guided her, encouraged her to remove certain items, even suggested how best to do it, and when she faltered, you ensured Harding's death appeared to seal her guilt, keeping you safely in the shadows." Finlay's jaw tightened. "She was vain enough to believe she'd acted alone. Everyone was. That's why it worked." Inspector Craddock, who had been quietly summoned by Miss Marple before her visit, stepped from the doorway. And it would have worked, if not for a certain lady's tea-time recollections. Finlay's composure slipped, but only for a moment. "I underestimated you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple gave him a small smile. "Many people do. It is most unwise." As Finlay was led away, Lucy sat in stunned silence. The case was indeed more tangled than she'd imagined. Geraldine was guilty, yes, but she had not been the architect of the scheme. That honor belonged to a quiet man with no taste for attention, only control. Miss Marple returned to her tea that evening with a faint sigh. Justice, she reflected, was rarely as simple as a single arrest, but at least, for now, the pattern was complete, every thread traced to its end. The Whitcomb affair ended as such affairs often do, not with a grand pronouncement in a crowded courtroom, but with a series of quiet conclusions that never reached the morning papers. Geraldine Whitcomb, faced with her own web of deceit and Lucy's testimony, accepted a plea rather than risk the full spectacle of trial. She would serve her sentence quietly, still protesting her dignity, while Lucy retreated into the care of distant relatives, her spirit worn thin but intact. But the true shock had been Finlay. The solicitor, mild and forgettable, had been the guiding hand all along, a man who manipulated without raising his voice, arranging the pieces so that Geraldine's downfall seemed inevitable. With his arrest, the Crown's case was tidy enough on paper. Yet, as Miss Marple knew, the law does not always catch every shadow. A week after Finlay's detainment, Inspector Craddock came to tea. He looked grim, a sure sign there was trouble. "He's managed it, Miss Marple," he said, setting his cup down with unusual force. "Slipped through on a technicality. The evidence against Geraldine stood firm, but Finlay, not enough to hold him. His fingerprints weren't on the poison, and every instruction he gave was just suggestion, nothing direct enough to tie him." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I did rather expect as much. Men like Mr. Finlay do not step into puddles if they can help it. They stand on the edge and nudge others forward." Craddock's voice was low, and now he's vanished, disappeared from his offices. No sign of where he's gone. Miss Marple didn't look surprised. She folded her knitting neatly. "You see, Inspector, Mr. Finlay's real crime was never the poisoning at all. It was in the years before, carefully weaving himself into the lives of those he might later control. Geraldine was merely the latest thread in his tapestry." Craddock frowned. "But how did you know? We were all so fixed on Geraldine." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, but that is the trouble with being too fixed, my dear. You look where the light falls and miss the shadow behind you." Geraldine's motives were obvious, but so was her carelessness. She hid nothing well, and yet someone had hidden things very well indeed. The diary burned at just the right moment. The decanter switched while she was conveniently distracted. Harding's papers vanished without anyone noticing until the day after. That is not the work of a vain woman. That is the work of a patient man. She reached for her tea, her tone still mild. "And then there was the matter of the letter, the one I placed in the frame. Finlay never looked at it. Geraldine could not take her eyes from it, but Finlay knew precisely what it was, because he had already destroyed the original. Only the person who had handled the original so completely would have no reaction to seeing it again." Craddock shook his head, a reluctant smile tugging at his mouth. "You're always 3 steps ahead of the rest of us, Miss Marple, and now he's gone." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "Gone, yes. But the world has a way of tripping such men when they least expect it. You will hear of Mr. Finlay again, Inspector. These threads always lead somewhere." Outside, the village went on as though nothing had happened. The Whitcomb estate stood quiet, its windows shuttered, its grand rooms collecting dust. Geraldine's name was whispered only in certain drawing rooms now, while Lucy faded from memory entirely. The case was considered closed, the official record neat and contained. But Miss Marple, sitting by her fire, knew better. Justice had been served in part, yes, but another part had slipped neatly away, like a shadow disappearing at dusk. And somewhere, in a quiet office or a distant city, Mr. Finlay would be arranging his pieces once more. She returned to her knitting, the pattern intricate and looping, each stitch careful. Patterns, she thought, have a way of repeating themselves, and she would be watching. It was a week after Geraldine's sentencing that St. Mary Mead finally settled into its usual rhythm. The post office resumed its quiet gossip, the vicar's wife returned to her endless church bazaars, and the Whitcomb estate, now closed, stood like grand, silent monument to scandal past. Miss Marple, as ever, returned to her garden. She pruned roses, tended her herbs, and seemed, at least to anyone watching, quite content to let the world move on. But even as she sat at her window with her tea, her mind wandered back to one small thing. It was the luggage. The battered leather case Finlay had been carrying for Lucy, the one with Harding's family crest faintly imprinted on it. After Finlay's disappearance, the case had been recovered, locked tight. When opened, it was empty. No documents, no incriminating evidence, merely a scrap of paper wedged in the lining. Craddock had shown it to her at the time, shaking his head. Nothing but a dry cleaner's stub from London, worthless. Miss Marple had not disagreed, though her mind had immediately noted the date on the stub, years before Harding's move to St. Mary Mead. Far too old for a man who replaced his luggage regularly. And why would such a slip be in Lucy's case at all? She had tucked the thought away, much as she tucked away the scrap of wool from her knitting basket when it did not match the pattern. Now, as she sorted her correspondence, a thick envelope arrived with no return address. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Inside, a single piece of stationery embossed with the name of a London club. No signature, just one line, written in a hand she recognized at once. The tapestry is not yet finished. Miss Marple set the paper down on her table, her lips pursed. It was exactly the sort of phrase a man like Finlay would choose. Subtle, smug, and just ambiguous enough to avoid the charge of a threat. Outside her window, the wind moved softly through the hedgerows. She could almost see it. Finlay, somewhere in London, blending into the background, beginning another arrangement. His work was quiet, patient, threads laid out in ways most would never see until the final knot was tied. She poured herself another cup of tea, her eyes drifting to the empty chair by the hearth. She imagined the next visitor, the next troubled relative, the next inspector, the next case. Because that was the truth she had learned long ago. A mystery never truly ends. Threads cross borders. People carry their pasts into new places, and sometimes the villain of one story becomes the shadow behind another. She folded the note neatly back into its envelope and placed it in her writing desk beside other curiosities. An unsigned postcard from Torquay, a pressed flower from a case in Sussex, a bus ticket from Paddington with no date. Little things, all of them, little threads. The village bell chimed the hour. Miss Marple rose, collected her basket, and stepped out into her garden. Another day, another puzzle quietly weaving itself into the edges of her life. Somewhere, the pattern was already forming, and she would be ready.